Hello, everyone, again. Thank you so much for joining us today for our 10-minute Bible lesson. We really appreciate it. If you've been tuning in here lately, you know we've been doing some lessons from the book of Proverbs, and we're going to do it again today. There's just so much in there. I found it so interesting. I hope that it's been helpful to you. Today we're going to be looking at Proverbs chapter 7, and then we're going to jump back a little bit for a few verses in Proverbs chapter 5. Now, I want to just kind of give you a little bit of a heads up. This particular lesson today is a little bit different. And the reason that it's different is because it is talking about Solomon warning his son against the dangers of sexual immorality. So, how about that? Are you ready for that? If you are, I hope you have your Bibles ready. Now, let me just mention this just before we read our first few verses, is that God is the one who gives us our moral code. If we make up our own moral code, then everybody's moral code will be different. But if God makes it, and He does, then it'll be a perfect code, and it'll be that for all of us. So He's the one who actually says what is sexually immoral, and He's also the one who can say what is sexually okay. Now, what is sexually okay? Well, let me just tell you, I've read the Bible and studied it a lot. Not that I know it all, I don't. But I do know this, that the Bible teaches that sex is supposed to be between a man and a woman that are married to each other. And that's what it teaches. And it actually goes on and teaches this, that anything other than that is a sin. So let's go ahead and jump in and start reading in Proverbs chapter 7, the first three verses. Now let me just kind of mention, the first three verses is kind of setting the tone for what advice that Solomon is going to give his son. And so what he's going to do is he's going to tell his son how valuable and how important his advice is that he's going to be given to him. So let me go ahead and read it to you. It's in Proverbs 7, verses 1 through 3. Here's what he said. He says, "My son, keep my words and treasure my commands within you. Keep my commands and live." That's what he tells his son. "And my law as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart." So here, Solomon is just telling his son how very important his advice is to him. In fact, he says he compares his advice as law. It's his law. It's the law of his father, and it's the commands from his father. So we can say that these things are really, really important. In fact, he tells his son to write those on his heart, on his own heart. Keep them in his heart. Then he says, wrap them around your finger. Tie them around your fingers. And then he goes on and says, keep as diligently as you would the apple of your eye. Now, I'm not positive what an apple of your eye is. I'm kind of thinking it's your pupil. But I know we like to protect our eyes. We certainly don't want anything to harm them. We guard them. And so he's saying these laws and these commands should be protected in that way. So here we go. Let's jump in and see what advice he's going to give. So this is in Proverbs chapter 7, verse 5. Here we go. So he says, that they may keep you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words. Wow. How about that? Now let me just kind of speak just a minute to the men. Let me be real frank to the men here. Most of us guys have a real weakness when it comes to women. And it's good for us to know that. And especially if the women, you might say, if they're attractive. Now, Solomon here is speaking to his son, but listen, guys, he's speaking to us too. And think about the one who's giving this advice. Solomon, he was like the wisest guy maybe that ever lived. But we know that even Solomon was led astray by the foreign wives that he married. In other words, his wives led him away from God. Now, you can study about that. And let me mention something else. Now, most people think Or you would think that maybe most people don't think this, but if you watch the news, you would think this is true, that the biggest sin of America is racism. Because you hear an awful lot about it all the time, or it seems like we do. Now, racism is a sin, there's no question about that. But I would just have a different opinion about that. I would just tell you that that is not the greatest sin of our country. I would say the greatest sin of our country is sexual immorality. I think that's the greatest sin. And to me, racism is almost like it kind of pales in comparison because it's such a destructive thing upon our culture. Now let's go on and read a little bit more what Solomon says. Now we're going to be jumping back down to chapter 5. So Proverbs 5, verses 3 through 5. Let's see what he said. He says, "For the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps lay hold of hail." Man, oh man. Now, this language is meant to deliberately be very strong and for good reason. Notice the enticement there. He says the immoral woman's lip drips. He says it drips honey. A woman that drips honey from her lips and her mouth is smoother than oil. Is that true? It is true. I think it is true. But notice something else, what Solomon says. He says, notice the end of the matter is very bitter. Hey, the beginning may be sweet, but the end has a terrible, terrible bite. And the fact of where it leads us to. Where does that lead us to? The end of it is death and hell. According to Solomon. Let's look at a few more of the statements. Now this is in Proverbs 5 verse 6. See what Solomon says. He says, "Lest you ponder her path of life. Her ways are unstable. You do not know them." So lest you ponder her path of life. That is to say, lest you stop a minute and give consideration to that way of life. Don't do that. He says, because her ways are unstable and you do not know them. Now, what does that mean, that you do not know them? I think that it means that Solomon is telling his son and telling us that we don't really know how dangerous that is. So we're not aware of that and how bad that is and how much trouble it could cause somebody. Let's read some more. In Proverbs chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. So Solomon says, "Remove your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your honor to others and your years to the cruel one." Man, I can tell you this ought to be mandatory reading for all of us. In fact, I think it ought to be mandatory to be read for us, or we should read it at least every 3 months or 4 months. And some of us, we ought to read it even more than that because it's so important. Now, look what he says. He says, "Remove your way from her." In fact, he says, "Remove your way far from her, and don't even come near that place." Do you remember the story of Joseph? I love the story of Joseph. Remember what happened to him? He was a nice-looking guy, and he worked for a guy named Potiphar. Potiphar was his master, but Potiphar's wife tried to get a hold of him. She tried to seduce him. In fact, she tried to get him and to catch him. And you know, his reaction was this: he had to flee from her. In fact, it says that he ran from her, and you know what? When you and I, are faced with some kind of temptation like that, this temptation is so dangerous that we can't piddle around with it. We've got to run from it. It's something that we have to flee from because the end will not be a good ending. It'll always be a bad ending. Notice that he says this. He says it'll end up, you'll give your honor to others and your years to the cruel one. My lands, we don't want our lives to end in dishonor, and we don't want to cause the remaining of our years to be given over to the cruel one, to the enemy. Anyway, listen, this is really, I think, really good advice. It's timely advice in the culture that we live in. And I don't know about you, but I'm thankful it's in the Bible. I'm thankful for these warnings. Listen, if we're out on the highway and we're driving, listen, we need the caution signs. And this is what this is. These are caution signs for us in the way we should live. I appreciate you tuning in today. I hope you have a really good week and hope you'll join in next week. I do have another short Bible lesson from Proverbs. So I hope you'll tune in and join us until next time.